The sharp crack of crystal against marble was the first sound, a gunshot in the symphony of quiet wealth. Then came the gasp, a collective intake of breath from the city's elite. A river of crimson, a priceless vintage, bled across the pristine white tuxedo of a man whose smile was as cold as the diamonds on his wrist. Ilara stood frozen, the silver tray still trembling in her hand, the epicenter of a disaster she didn't cause. The billionaire, a titan of industry with a reputation for casual cruelty, had extended his leg with practiced ease. Now, his laughter echoed in the sudden, predatory silence of the grand ballroom. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin like a vice, forcing her to look at the ruin he had orchestrated. The world narrowed to his sneering face, and the suffocating weight of 100 pairs of eyes watching her humiliation unfold. But the silence that followed was far more dangerous than the shouting, and if you watch until the end, you'll discover why a single glance can be a death sentence or a salvation. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Her name was Ilara, 26 years old, though the exhaustion in her eyes made her seem older. She was a ghost in a borrowed uniform, a server by necessity, moving through these gilded cages to pay for a life that was slowly fading in a hospital bed, her younger sister's. Dignity was her only currency, a quiet, unyielding refusal to be broken by the small cruelties of her world. Every polished glass and every forced smile was a small act of defiance against the crushing weight of medical bills and the gnawing loneliness that defined her existence. She had learned long ago to make herself small, to be invisible, because in her world, being seen was a liability. Tonight, that invisibility had been stripped away, leaving her exposed under the merciless glare of chandeliers and contempt. The ballroom itself felt oppressive, a cavern of shimmering gold and shadowed corners on the 50th floor of a Chicago skyscraper. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, conspiratorial hum of power being exchanged. Crystal glasses clinked like distant, fragile bells, and the soft strains of a string quartet were a thin veneer over the brutal ambition that pulsed beneath the surface. For the people here, this was a playground. For Ilara, it was a battlefield where she fought for survival with a polite nod and a steady hand. She saw the stark contrast between their effortless existence and her own desperate struggle, a chasm so wide it felt like it could swallow her whole. The opulence was not beautiful. It was a constant, suffocating reminder of everything she did not have. The billionaire's grip tightened, yanking her forward. "On your knees," he hissed, his voice low enough for only her to hear, but his intent clear to the entire room. "Clean it. With a napkin." The demand was not about the suit. It was about power, about demonstrating his ability to shatter a person for sport. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird, trapped in a cage of bone. Her mind, however, was a storm of cold, hard math. Losing this job meant missing a payment for her sister's treatment. That single thought was more terrifying than the man in front of her. Shame burned her cheeks, a hot, invasive flush. But beneath it, a core of steel began to form. She would not cry. She would not give him the satisfaction. Her gaze remained fixed on a point just past his shoulder, her body trembling but her spirit refusing to kneel. This silent strength was a legacy, a lesson learned from a father who had lost everything but his honor. He had taught her that the world would try to take everything from you, piece by piece, until all you had left was the choice of how you faced your own ruin. She had seen injustice before, had felt its sting in the casual dismissal of bosses and the predatory calculations of landlords. Each instance had chipped away at her trust in the world, but had only hardened her resolve to remain whole. In a city built on compromise and corruption, her unbending moral code was both her heaviest burden and her only true possession. It was a quiet, lonely faith, one that offered no rewards, only the grim satisfaction of knowing she had not sold her soul for an easier life. The silence in the room stretched, becoming a physical presence. It was no longer just the absence of sound, but a heavy, expectant blanket of judgment. She could feel the stares of the other guests, their faces a gallery of morbid curiosity, pity, and a chilling, detached amusement. The music had faltered and died, leaving only the distant hum of the city far below. Every breath she took felt loud, every tremor of her hand a public confession of her fear. The world had shrunk to this single, unbearable moment, a tableau of power and powerlessness. The scent of spilled wine, rich and sweet, now smelled like blood and failure. Time had slowed to a crawl, each second an eternity of public disgrace, and she felt herself beginning to fray at the edges, the carefully constructed walls of her composure threatening to crumble into dust. Then something shifted. It was not a sound, but a change in the quality of the silence. A pocket of cold air seemed to move through the overheated room, and the weight of the crowd's attention subtly moved away from her. A shadow detached itself from a secluded table in the far corner of the room, a place shrouded in velvet darkness where the city's true power resided, far from the garish lights. She didn't see a face, only a silhouette rising with an unnerving, deliberate grace. The air grew still, charged with a new kind of tension, not the cheap drama of a billionaire's tantrum, but something ancient, absolute, and infinitely more dangerous. A predator had entered the clearing, and Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her humiliation was about to become the smallest part of her night. The city breathed a cold, metallic sigh against the bus window, blurring the towering silhouettes of downtown Chicago into a watercolor of gray and steel. Alara watched her own reflection, a pale ghost superimposed over the relentless motion of the streets. She was a creature of the in-between hours, living in the pre-dawn darkness and the late-night fatigue. Her world was a series of transitions, from the cramped, anonymous space on public transit to the suffocating opulence of the places she served. Each day was a pilgrimage of survival, measured not in hours, but in the number of polite smiles she could muster while her soul screamed. The uniform she wore, a stark black and white, was less an outfit and more a cloak of invisibility, a necessary surrender of self in a world that only valued her function, not her existence. Her apartment was a small sanctuary of silence, a single room that held the entirety of her life. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the antiseptic soap she used to scrub the day from her skin. On a small, worn table, a stack of envelopes sat like a monument to her anxiety, medical bills, final notices, letters filled with cold, unforgiving numbers. The only warmth in the room came from a single framed photograph of her and her younger sister, Maya, their smiles captured from a time before illness had stolen the color from Maya's cheeks. Alara would trace the outline of her sister's face each night, a silent promise that she would not falter, that she would bear any weight, endure any shame, to keep that fragile light from extinguishing completely. This room was her cage, but it was also her reason to fight. The hospital was another world entirely, one governed by the sterile beep of machines and the hushed, somber tones of doctors. Visiting Maya was a ritual of forced optimism. Alara would recount funny stories about difficult customers, her voice light and steady, carefully editing out the parts that revealed her own exhaustion and despair. She would hold Maya's thin hand, feeling the delicate bones beneath the skin, and talk about a future that felt increasingly like a fantasy, a small house near the lake, a garden, a life where the loudest sound was the wind, not a heart monitor. Leaving was always the hardest part, walking back out into the city's indifferent sprawl, with the weight of her sister's quiet hope pressing down on her, a burden more sacred and terrifying than any debt. Her direct supervisor, a man named Mr. Davies, thrived on small acts of cruelty. He was a gatekeeper to a world just above hers, and he wielded his minor authority like a weapon. He would inspect her uniform with a predatory gaze, searching for a single loose thread, a microscopic stain. His praise was always backhanded, his corrections always public. Ilara, a smile costs you nothing, he would say, his own smile never reaching his cold, calculating eyes. She learned to absorb his condescension with a placid expression, a mask of professional deference that concealed the simmering rage beneath. He was a constant, grinding reminder of her powerlessness, another link in the chain that bound her to this life of quiet servitude, where her dignity was a currency he was determined to devalue. The uniform itself was a paradox. It was armor, shielding her from personal connection and unwanted attention, allowing her to move through lavish spaces as an unnoticed part of the machinery. But it was also a cage, a constant reminder of her station. When she put it on, she methodically erased the person underneath, her fears, her dreams, her exhaustion. She became the server, a pair of hands, a polite voice, an entity without a past or a future. This daily act of self-effacement was a slow, corrosive process, chipping away at her sense of self. She feared the day she would look in the mirror and no longer recognize the woman staring back, seeing only the empty, functional shell the world demanded her to be. Yet within that rigid existence, she found small ways to reclaim her humanity. She would be the one to bring a glass of water to a flustered kitchen porter or offer a genuine word of comfort to a coworker on the verge of tears. These were quiet rebellions, tiny sparks of empathy in a world that encouraged indifference. Once, she found a diamond earring on the floor of the ladies' restroom and spent 20 minutes tracking down its owner, a woman who snatched it from her hand with a dismissive nod. Ilara expected no thanks. The act itself was the reward, a private confirmation that, despite the pressures to become hard and cynical, the moral compass her father had instilled in her still pointed true north, even in the darkest of places. The debt was a living thing, a shadow that followed her everywhere. It dictated how many hours she slept, what she ate, and whether she could afford the luxury of getting sick. The numbers grew with a relentless, malignant logic, each new bill a fresh wave of panic that threatened to pull her under. She would lie awake at night, the figures swirling in her mind, a suffocating arithmetic of survival. It was a silent, lonely battle, fought in the margins of a society that celebrated wealth while punishing poverty. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe. She was running a race she could never win, fueled only by a desperate, all-consuming love for the one person whose life depended on her not giving up. In the rare moments of quiet, she allowed herself to dream, not of riches or escape, but of simple, unattainable peace. She dreamt of walking barefoot on a beach, the sun warming her face, with Maya running ahead, healthy and laughing. She dreamt of a morning without the jarring alarm, a day that belonged entirely to her, with no uniforms to wear or tables to set. These were not grand ambitions, but fundamental human desires that her circumstances had rendered into impossible luxuries. This secret, inner world was her last refuge, a place where she was not defined by her job or her debts, but by her capacity for hope. It was a fragile, precious thing, and she guarded it fiercely against the encroaching darkness of her reality. The assignment to work the annual Moretti Foundation Gala was delivered by Mr. Davies with a thin, predatory smile. It was the most high-profile, high-pressure event of the year, a gathering of the city's untouchable elite. For most, it would be a coveted post, a chance for bigger tips. For Ilara, it felt like a sentence. Davies knew she hated the performative nature of these events, the casual cruelty of the ultra-rich. He was setting a trap, placing her in an environment where a single mistake could mean immediate dismissal. "Don't disappoint me, Ilara," he had said, his tone making it clear that he hoped she would. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach as she accepted the assignment, knowing she was about to step into the lion's den. And so she found herself there, on the 50th floor, a ghost moving through a constellation of shimmering diamonds and shadowed ambition. The air was thick with power, a palpable force that made the crystal chandeliers tremble. She balanced her silver tray with practiced precision, her face a mask of serene professionalism, her mind a whirlwind of anxiety. She kept her eyes down, her movements fluid and unobtrusive, trying to become one with the background hum of the event. Her focus narrowed to the task at hand: pour the wine, clear the plates, remain invisible. She moved toward a table where the laughter was loudest, a circle of men in expensive suits, and approached the one in the white tuxedo, completely unaware that she was walking toward the single moment that would shatter her world. This single glance was about to become a death sentence or a salvation, a turning point from which there would be no return. If you felt the weight of Ilara's world, like this video, share it with someone who understands the power of quiet strength, and comment below if you believe one person can change another's fate. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer merely an absence of sound. It had become a living entity, heavy and suffocating. It shifted from morbid curiosity to something colder, something primal, a collective, unspoken fear. The change originated from a secluded alcove, a pocket of shadow where the true architects of the city's underbelly held court. A figure rose from the darkness, not with haste, but with a deliberate, fluid grace that was more menacing than any sudden movement. He was a silhouette against the glittering skyline, a void in the opulent light. The low hum of gossip and nervous whispers died instantly, replaced by a stillness so profound that Alara could hear the frantic, terrified beat of her own heart. A predator had just announced its presence, and the herd had frozen in instinctive terror, recognizing a power far greater than the cheap bravado of a billionaire. He moved through the parted crowd as if walking through water, the city's elite shrinking away from his path without a single command. His suit was the color of a moonless night, tailored with a precision that spoke of immense wealth and discipline, yet it seemed to absorb the light around him, making him appear more shadow than man. His steps were silent on the marble floor, a testament to a life lived in places where noise was a liability. He was not large, but his presence consumed the space, his controlled economy of motion suggesting a deep reservoir of coiled, lethal energy. Ilara watched his approach, her fear of the billionaire dissolving into a new, more profound and elemental dread. This was not a man who played games of public humiliation. This was a man who ended them, permanently. As he drew closer, the details of his face emerged from the shadows. It was a face carved from granite and regret, handsome in a severe, unforgiving way. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, a stark contrast to the youthful intensity in his eyes. They were the color of storm clouds, intelligent and ancient, holding a chilling stillness that seemed to see straight through the artifice of the room and into the fractured core of every person he observed. A thin, pale scar cut through his left eyebrow, a silent testament to a past written in violence. He carried an aura of profound loneliness, a self-imposed isolation that was more intimidating than any display of physical force. He was a king in a kingdom of ghosts, and his throne was built on a foundation of silence and secrets. He did not spare a glance for the gawking crowd. His focus was absolute, fixed on the scene of Alara's disgrace. He stopped beside the billionaire, his proximity alone a suffocating weight. Then, he raised his hand and placed it gently on the man's shoulder. The gesture was deceptively light, almost paternal, yet the billionaire froze as if struck by lightning, his face draining of all color. The contact was not a threat. It was a claim of ownership over the very air the man breathed. The entire room held its breath, witnessing a silent, brutal transfer of power. The air crackled with what was unsaid, with the history of a name that could crumble empires with a whisper. Dante Moretti did not need to raise his voice. His reputation spoke for him in a language of pure, unadulterated fear. Dante's eyes, cold and devoid of emotion, met the billionaire's. There was no anger in his gaze, only a profound, dismissive finality. It was the look of a man observing an insect, a momentary annoyance before it was crushed. He said nothing. He did not have to. The billionaire, a man who commanded boardrooms and terrified subordinates, began to tremble, his bravado shattering like cheap glass. He stammered, a pathetic, choked sound, before Dante gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a dismissal. The man scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet, his retreat a clumsy, desperate flight. He vanished into the crowd, a titan reduced to a coward by a single, silent touch. The spectacle was over, but a far more dangerous one was just beginning. Then, that unnerving calm turned to Alara. The full weight of his attention settled upon her, and the vast, opulent ballroom seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them. The air grew thin, and the distant city lights blurred into a meaningless smear of color. She stood rooted to the spot, the broken crystal and spilled wine at her feet forgotten. Her body still trembled from the adrenaline and shame. But as he looked at her, a different sensation began to take root, not just fear, but a strange, terrifying current of awareness. He was not looking at a clumsy server or a victim. He was looking at her with an intensity that felt as if he were peeling back the layers of her exhaustion and despair to see the woman she kept hidden from the world. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, the world fell away. She expected to see contempt, or perhaps a cold, detached pity. Instead, she saw a flicker of something she could not name, a dark, startling recognition. Her own gaze, though she was terrified, did not waver. It was clear, direct, and unbroken, a small, desperate act of holding on to the last shred of her dignity. For a fleeting second, she saw past the fearsome crime boss and glimpsed the man beneath, a soul as wounded and guarded as her own, though his scars were of a different, more violent making. The silence stretched between them, charged with a tension that was more intimate and dangerous than any physical touch, a silent acknowledgement of two solitary souls recognizing a shared defiance in the other. His voice, when it finally came, was a low baritone, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones rather than strike her ears. "You've made a spectacle," he said, the words a simple statement of fact, devoid of accusation. His gaze swept over the room, a silent condemnation of the vultures who had watched her humiliation for sport. He then returned his focus to her, his eyes holding hers in an unyielding grip. "And you owe a debt for the disturbance." The words hung in the air, a chillingly ambiguous pronouncement. A debt? To whom? Her mind raced, unable to grasp the logic of his statement. She was the one who had been wronged, yet he spoke as if she were the one who had transgressed some unspoken code. He took a half step closer, the subtle scent of expensive cologne, sandalwood, and cold night air enveloping her. The proximity was overwhelming, a deliberate closing of the space between their two disparate worlds. "You will pay for it," he continued, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. It was not a threat, but a verdict, delivered with the absolute authority of a man who had never been denied. He paused, letting the weight of his declaration settle upon her. 1 week. By my side. The command was a shackle, binding her to him with invisible chains. He was not saving her from the billionaire. He was claiming her, pulling her from the shallow cruelty of the public world into the deeper, more treacherous currents of his own. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, his departure as silent and commanding as his arrival. The crowd parted for him once more, a sea of whispers and fearful glances following in his wake. Ilara remained frozen, the echo of his voice resonating in the sudden emptiness. The room slowly began to breathe again, the low hum of conversation returning. But for her, the world had been irrevocably altered. He was gone, but his presence lingered like a ghost, a chilling promise of a debt she did not understand, and a week that would undoubtedly cost her far more than just her time. The stain on the marble floor was no longer just spilled wine. It was a map marking the exact spot where her life had ended, and a new, terrifying one had begun. The first day of her debt began in silence. A black sedan, so quiet it seemed to absorb the city's noise, appeared at her curb precisely at dawn. The driver, a man with a face as impassive as stone, simply opened the rear door. Inside, Dante Moretti sat opposite, looking out at her worn apartment building with an unreadable expression. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs as she slid onto the cold leather seat. The interior smelled of sandalwood and something else. Something metallic and clean, like rain on asphalt. The door closed with a heavy, final thud, sealing her inside his world. He didn't speak as the car pulled into the stream of traffic, leaving her to grapple with the suffocating reality of her new, gilded cage, a prisoner in a suit of tailored wool. They drove to a skyscraper that pierced the clouds, a monument of glass and steel that housed the Moretti Empire. His private office was a study in controlled austerity, dark wood, polished chrome, and a single, vast window that offered a god's-eye view of the city she struggled in below. He gestured to a chair. "Sit." Her task for the day was simple, almost absurdly so. She was to sort through a box of old photographs, organizing them by date. They were black and white images of a younger Dante with a man who shared his intense eyes, his father. There were no smiles, only a shared look of grim determination. She worked in silence, acutely aware of him at his desk, the soft scratch of his pen, the only sound. He wasn't watching her, yet she felt his presence in every corner of the room. The next day, he was waiting for her outside the hospital. The coincidence was too precise to be an accident. He had been watching her, learning the rhythms of her life. He stood by his car, a stark figure against the backdrop of suffering and hope, and simply held out a coffee cup. "You look tired," he stated, his voice a low rumble that cut through the morning chill. The gesture was so unexpectedly human that it disarmed her. She took the cup, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. He didn't ask about her sister, but his presence there, at the epicenter of her pain, was a silent acknowledgement of her deepest vulnerability. It was a calculated move, and yet it felt like the first crack in his stone facade. He began to appear in the quiet corners of her life, a shadow she could never quite shake. One evening, as she left her late shift at a second, grittier restaurant job she kept secret, his car was parked across the street, its engine a low thrum in the darkness. He didn't get out. He just watched until she was safely on the bus, a silent, unnerving guardian. She felt a confusing mixture of terror and a strange, unwelcome sense of being protected. He was invading her life, mapping her weaknesses, yet his surveillance felt less like a threat and more like a vigil. She started to understand that his power wasn't just in violence and intimidation. It was in his profound, unsettling knowledge of the world and the people in it. He saw the parts of her she kept hidden, and that was the most frightening thing of all. On the fourth day, he took her to a private library hidden within an old, exclusive club. The room smelled of aged paper and leather, a sanctuary of silence and history. He pulled a book from a high shelf, a worn volume of classic poetry. He didn't offer it to her, but instead began to read aloud, his voice filling the quiet space. The poem was about loss and a defiant, solitary honor. It was a confession, she realized, a glimpse into the code that governed his dark world, a code inherited from the man in the photographs. She listened, mesmerized, watching the way the low light caught the silver in his hair. In that moment, he was not a crime boss. He was a man haunted by the ghosts of his own principles, and she saw a profound loneliness in him that mirrored her own. The tension between them became a language of its own, spoken in prolonged glances and heavy silences. During a dinner at a restaurant so exclusive it had no sign, the air between them was thick, with unspoken questions. He watched the way she held her silverware, the quiet dignity in her posture. She, in turn, watched him, noticing the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room, even when his attention seemed to be on her. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "Because you did not kneel," he said, the words landing with the weight of a final judgment. It was not about the spilled wine. It had never been about the wine. It was about the strength he saw in her, a light he seemed determined to keep close to his own darkness. Her fear began to war with a dangerous fascination. She saw the brutality of his world in the deferential terror of the men who served him, in the whispered phone calls that ended with a clipped, final command. He was a creature of violence, a king ruling an empire built on fear. Yet, she also saw him place a folded bill into the hand of a homeless veteran without a word, his expression unreadable. She saw him listen to the somber music of a lone cellist in a subway station, his eyes closed as if in prayer. He was a paradox, a man of profound contradictions. He was a monster who appreciated beauty, a killer who understood honor. And this duality drew her in, pulling her deeper into a moral ambiguity that threatened to unravel her own carefully constructed sense of right and wrong. He, too, was fighting a battle she could not see. Alara's presence was a constant, quiet disruption to his rigidly controlled world. Her unwavering moral compass was a mirror, reflecting the man he might have been, the honor his father had tried to instill in him before this life had demanded its sacrifice. He found himself watching her simple, honest gestures, the way she thanked a busboy, the genuine concern in her eyes when she spoke of her sister. These small acts of grace were a foreign language he had long forgotten. She was a reminder of a purity he believed no longer existed, and her courage, the quiet, unyielding strength she possessed, was beginning to dismantle the walls he had built around his heart. She made him feel a dangerous, unfamiliar urge, the desire to protect something other than his empire. One afternoon, in his office, she was replacing the old photographs in their box when her hand slipped, sending a small, silver frame clattering to the floor. The glass shattered. She froze, expecting an explosion of anger. Dante rose from his desk, his movements slow and deliberate. He knelt beside her, not looking at the broken frame, but at her hand, where a small shard of glass had drawn a single drop of blood. Without a word, he took her hand in his. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his fingers warm and firm around hers. He carefully removed the sliver of glass, his focus absolute. For a long, breathless moment he held her hand, his thumb stroking softly over her skin before he let go. The intimacy of the gesture was more shocking than any threat could have been. The week was a slow, agonizing dance of proximity and distance. He would bring her into the heart of his opulent world, then leave her in suffocating silence for hours. He would share a moment of unexpected connection, then retreat behind a wall of cold indifference. She felt like she was being tested, her resolve and her character scrutinized under his relentless gaze. She tried to maintain her distance, to remember the chasm that separated them, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The lines were blurring. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but it was now intertwined with a growing, treacherous empathy for the lonely king in his shadowed kingdom. She was no longer just his captive. She was becoming his confessor, a silent witness to the man behind the myth. Her presence began to soften the hard edges of his world, a change so subtle only he could feel it. The silence in his office, once a tool of intimidation, now felt different when she was in it, less empty, more contemplative. He found himself making small, unconscious adjustments to accommodate her. He had the heating turned up slightly, remembering the way she rubbed her arms in the chill. He had a different kind of tea brought in, noticing she never touched the strong black blend he preferred. These were minor, insignificant acts, yet for a man like Dante Moretti, they were seismic shifts. They were concessions, chinks in his armor, admissions of a vulnerability he could not afford to have. He was a man who controlled everything, and he was losing control over the one thing that mattered most, himself. She learned to read his moods in the tightening of his jaw or the stillness of his hands. She could sense when a storm was brewing within him, a darkness that had nothing to do with her. During one such moment, as he stood staring out his office window, his back rigid with a tension that seemed to vibrate through the room, she did something impulsive. She walked over to the antique record player in the corner and put on a soft, melancholic piece of classical music she had heard him listening to before. She didn't say a word. She simply let the music fill the silence. After a long moment, the rigid line of his shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection of the glass. It was a silent thank you, an acknowledgement of a comfort he would never ask for, but desperately needed. The collision of their worlds was becoming more frequent, more dangerous. He took her to a high-stakes poker game in the back room of a dimly lit jazz club. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the metallic scent of fear. Men with fortunes and futures on the line looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and pity, assuming she was his property. But Dante's demeanor was different. He kept her slightly behind him, a subtle but clear gesture of protection, shielding her from their predatory gazes. He played with a terrifying calm, his face an unreadable mask, but she could feel the violence simmering just beneath the surface of the polite game. She was a spectator in a theater of quiet brutality, and she realized he had brought her here not to intimidate her, but to show her exactly who he was, to test if she would still look at him without flinching. She didn't flinch. As they left the club, the cool night air a welcome relief, she felt a strange sense of clarity. She was terrified of his world, of the casual violence and the moral decay, but she was no longer terrified of him. She saw the crushing weight of the crown he wore, the lonely burden of his power. He had shown her the very worst of his life, and in her steady, compassionate gaze, he found not judgment, but a quiet, unnerving understanding. This silent acceptance was more disarming than any weapon ever used against him. It made him feel seen in a way he never had been before, and the feeling was both a salvation and a curse, pulling him toward a light he knew he had no right to touch. The final night of her debt arrived, a promise of release that now felt more like a sentence of exile. He drove her not to her apartment, but to a deserted pier overlooking the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan. The city glittered in the distance, a cold, beautiful beast. They stood in silence, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face. "Your debt is paid," he said, his voice low against the sound of the waves. The words should have been a relief, but they felt like a final, severing blow. The thought of returning to her old life, to the crushing weight of her loneliness without the strange, intense gravity of his presence, was suddenly unbearable. The world felt less safe without its most dangerous man standing beside her. As they stood there, suspended in a moment of quiet finality, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed on the wooden planks behind them. Two large, menacing figures emerged from the shadows, their intentions immediately clear in their aggressive posture. They were not Dante's men. Their eyes were fixed on Ilara, a predatory gleam that made her blood run cold. They were low-level thugs, opportunistic and cruel, the kind of random violence the city bred in its dark corners. They saw a woman alone with a man in an expensive suit, an easy target. A sneer spread across one of the men's faces as he pulled a knife, its blade catching the faint moonlight. "Look what we have here," he rasped, taking a step toward her. Before Ilara could even process the threat, Dante moved. It wasn't a rush. It was an unfolding, a shift from perfect stillness to lethal motion that was too fast to follow. He placed himself directly in front of her, a solid, unbreachable wall between her and the danger. He didn't look at the men. He looked only at her, his eyes dark with a protective fury that stole her breath. "Close your eyes," he commanded, his voice a soft, deadly whisper meant only for her. It was not a suggestion. It was a final, desperate attempt to shield her, not from the violence he was about to unleash, but from the truth of what he was capable of. A monster stepping out of the shadows to protect his only light. But Ilara did not close her eyes. That was her transgression. Her entire life had been a lesson in looking away, in making herself small and unseeing to survive. To obey his command would be to continue that pattern, to accept the shield he offered, and remain a protected, ignorant thing. But in that split second, a defiant, reckless impulse seized her. She needed to know. She needed to see the truth of the man who had claimed her, to witness the full, unvarnished cost of his protection. She kept her eyes open, her gaze fixed on him, choosing to face the monster head-on. It was a silent rebellion, a breaking of her own deepest rule, and in that moment she was no longer a victim waiting for the storm to pass. She was a witness, deliberately standing in its path. The violence was not a brawl, it was a brutal, surgical ballet. Dante moved with an economy of motion that was terrifying in its efficiency. There was no wasted energy, no theatrical flourish. He was a blur of dark wool and brutal precision, deflecting the knife with a turn of his wrist that broke the man's arm with a sickening, audible crack. The second attacker lunged, and Dante met him not with fury, but with a cold, detached finality. A swift, disabling strike to the throat, followed by a blow that sent the man crumpling to the pier like a discarded coat. It was over in less than 5 seconds. The sounds were clipped and ugly, the snap of bone, a choked gasp, the heavy thud of bodies on wood. It was the work of a man for whom violence was not an act of passion, but a language he spoke with absolute fluency. A profound, ringing silence descended upon the pier, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind and the gentle lapping of the lake. The two men lay still, twisted shapes in the pale moonlight, their brief, brutish existence extinguished with terrifying ease. The air grew thick, with the coppery scent of blood, a smell that clung to the cold, damp wood. Ilara's breath hitched in her throat, a small, sharp sound in the vast quiet. She had seen violence on the news, in movies, but this was different. This was real, immediate, and intimate. It was a part of him, a darkness he had unleashed without hesitation, and its raw power left her feeling hollowed out, as if the world she knew had just been stripped of all its familiar laws and replaced with his. He stood over them for a moment, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just wrought. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. His face was a mask of cold control, but his eyes told a different story. They were dark, haunted, and filled with a stark, agonizing vulnerability. He knew she had watched. He could see it in the wide, unblinking horror and fascination in her gaze. In that moment, he was stripped bare. He had broken his most sacred rule, never to let the violence of his world touch the purity of hers. He had not just protected her body, he had irrevocably stained her soul with the truth of his own, and the self-loathing in his eyes was more profound than any physical wound. He took a step toward her, then another, his movements heavy, as if wading through the wreckage of the moment he had created. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the icy night air. His knuckles were split, a small, stark testament to the force of his blows. He looked down at her, his expression a storm of conflicting emotions, regret, fury, and a desperate, aching need. He had shown her the monster, the part of him he kept locked away in the deepest recesses of his soul, and now he seemed to be waiting for the inevitable verdict, for her to flee from the darkness he could no longer conceal. The space between them crackled with the terrible, unspoken truth of what had just happened. Then he reached out. His hand, still trembling with the faintest tremor of adrenaline, rose slowly and cupped her jaw. The gesture was shockingly gentle, his thumb stroking softly against her skin. It was not a gesture of ownership or control, but one of profound, desperate grounding. It was as if he were trying to anchor himself to her, to the one point of light in the consuming darkness of his actions. His touch was a silent, desperate plea for an understanding he had no right to ask for. His eyes bored into hers, searching for something, absolution, condemnation, anything other than the empty horror he expected to find. The contact was a bridge across the bloody chasm he had just opened between them, a fragile, dangerous connection, forged in violence and fear. In that single, searing touch, she understood everything. The cold control, the silent observation, the kingdom built on fear. It was all a cage, a fortress he had built around a core of profound, inherited pain. The violence she had just witnessed was not a display of power, but an act of sacrifice. He had chosen to become the monster to protect her from the monsters of the world. He had exposed the very worst of himself to preserve the best in her. A wave of empathy, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees, washed over her, drowning out the fear. She saw not a killer, but a man condemned to a lonely throne, a king who had just laid down his crown and his sword at her feet, revealing the wounded man beneath. She did not pull away. She did not flinch. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement that was a universe of acceptance. She raised her own trembling hand and placed it over his, her fingers cool against his skin. It was an answer. It was forgiveness. It was a promise that she saw all of him, the darkness and the light, the monster and the man, and she was not running. For Dante, this small, quiet gesture was a cataclysm. It was a grace he had never known, a silent acceptance that shattered the foundations of his solitary world. The carefully constructed walls around his heart did not just crack. They crumbled into dust, leaving him utterly exposed, utterly vulnerable, in the steady, compassionate gaze of the only person who had ever truly seen him. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a flicker of profound, unbearable relief and pain crossing his features. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. He dropped his hand, severing the connection, and the cold of the night rushed back into the space between them. He took a step back, the mask of the impassive crime boss slowly reassembling itself, but the cracks were still visible. The air was thick, with the consequences of the line they had just crossed. He had killed for her. She had accepted him. There was no going back. The rules of their separate worlds had been broken, and they were now adrift in a new, undefined territory, a dangerous landscape where his darkness and her light were inextricably, irrevocably intertwined. They stood in the aftermath, two solitary figures on a pier stained with blood, the city lights across the water now looking like a distant, alien shore. The bodies of the men were a grim testament to the choice he had made, and the silence between them was no longer one of tension or curiosity, but of a shared, profound, and terrifying knowledge. Nothing needed to be said. The act itself was a vow, a confession, and a sentence all in one. He had saved her life, but in doing so he had bound her to his, a fate that was both a sanctuary and a cage. The debt was no longer hers to pay, it was now a shared burden, and its weight would follow them long after the sirens began to wail in the distance. The drive back to her apartment was a journey through a vacuum. Dante handled the car with a chilling, detached precision, his eyes fixed on the rain-slicked ribbon of asphalt ahead. He did not speak. He did not look at her. The silence in the car was a different entity from the one they had shared before. It was no longer charged with curiosity and tension, but was a heavy, dead thing, thick with the scent of blood and the ghost of violence. The city lights smeared against the windows, a watercolor of a world she no longer recognized. When he pulled up to her curb, the engine's low hum was the only sound. He unlocked the doors without a word. It was a dismissal, colder and more final than any command he had ever given. He was pushing her away, back into her world, but the border between them had been permanently erased. Inside her small room, the familiar silence felt alien, predatory. Every shadow seemed to hold the memory of the men on the pier, every creak of the old building a phantom footstep. She stood in the center of the floor, the damp chill of the night still clinging to her coat, and felt the profound dislocation of a survivor. Her world of overdue bills and rude customers had been a simple, understandable hardship. This new reality was a labyrinth of moral ambiguity and lethal consequences. She looked at her own hands, half expecting to see them stained. The life she had fought so hard to keep clean and honorable had been irrevocably marked by his darkness, and the quiet dignity of her poverty now felt like a naive and fragile thing, shattered beyond repair. She was no longer just a woman struggling to get by. She was a secret he had to keep. In his penthouse, a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the sleeping city, Dante stood before a vast window, watching the rain wash the streets clean. It could not, however, wash the blood from his hands or the image of her face from his mind. He had seen everything in her eyes, the horror, the shock, but beneath it all, an unnerving, terrifying acceptance. That acceptance was a judgment more severe than any condemnation. It meant she understood, and that understanding was a bond he could not allow. To keep her in his world now, after what she had seen, would be a death sentence. Rivals would see her as a weakness, a pressure point to be exploited. He had not saved her on the pier. He had merely painted a target on her back, and the only way to protect her was to become a ghost in her life, to cut the cord so cleanly she would believe it had never existed. The days that followed were defined by his absence. The black sedan no longer waited at her corner. The oppressive weight of his presence was replaced by the crushing weight of its void. She returned to her job, moving through the motions of serving and clearing, her body on autopilot while her mind replayed the brutal efficiency of his movements. Her supervisor's petty cruelties now seemed pathetic, the complaints of wealthy patrons like the buzzing of insects. Everything felt distant, muted. She would stand at her window, watching the rain fall, tracing the path of a single drop as it slid down the glass. The city felt vast and empty, a landscape of strangers, and the loneliness that had once been her constant companion now felt sharper, more profound, because for a brief, terrifying week, she had not been alone. The pain of his absence slowly, chemically, transformed into a kind of lucid strength. The fear that had once governed her life, fear of debt, of failure, of losing her sister, was replaced by a cold, clear-eyed understanding of what real danger looked like. She was no longer a victim of circumstance, but a survivor of a war she hadn't known she was fighting. This new perspective was a heavy armor. She began to move through the world with a different kind of quietness, not the shrinking invisibility of before, but a watchful, deliberate stillness. She saw the city not as a collection of buildings and streets, but as a complex ecosystem of power, with predators and prey moving in the shadows. He had taught her to see the world as he did, and it was a terrible, irreversible gift. Her newfound awareness was not paranoia, it was a necessary shield. One evening, leaving the hospital, she noticed a dark gray car parked halfway down the block, the same car she had seen near her apartment the day before. A man sat behind the wheel, his face obscured by shadow, but his attention was a palpable weight on her skin. He wasn't one of Dante's men. His stillness was sloppy, impatient. This was the consequence, the ripple effect of the violence on the pier. She was a loose thread, a witness, a liability. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in her stomach. But she did not panic. She simply lowered her head, quickened her pace toward the brightly lit bus stop, and disappeared into the anonymity of the evening crowd, her heart a steady, cold drum against her ribs. From a rooftop several blocks away, Dante watched her through a pair of powerful binoculars. He saw the gray car. He saw the flicker of recognition and fear in her posture, and the controlled, intelligent way she reacted. A surge of protective fury warred with a grim, agonizing pride. She was learning. She was surviving. He had already dispatched 2 of his most trusted men to deal with the Watcher, a low-level enforcer from a rival family testing the waters. The threat would be neutralized silently, permanently, but it was a temporary solution. As long as she was connected to him, even by rumor, she would never be safe. He lowered the binoculars, the city lights blurring in his vision. The only way to truly protect her was to vanish from her life so completely that even his enemies would believe she meant nothing to him. She understood his silence now. It was not abandonment. It was sanctuary. It was the only act of true protection he could offer, a painful, surgical severing intended for her own good. The realization did not lessen the ache of his absence, but it gave it a solemn, tragic meaning. She was a liability he had chosen to bear from a distance, and this silent, lonely vigil was his penance. She took the quiet strength this knowledge gave her and focused it back where it belonged, on Maya. She sat by her sister's bedside, holding her hand, and for the first time in months, she did not feel the crushing weight of despair. Instead, she felt a grim, unyielding resolve. She had walked through the fire of another man's hell and had come out changed, stronger, and she would use that strength to pull her sister back into the light. One morning, a plain manila envelope appeared under her door. It was thick, heavy, with no return address. Inside was a cashier's check, drawn from an anonymous corporate account, for an amount that made her breath catch in her throat. It was enough. Enough for all of Maya's treatments. Enough for the experimental therapies the doctors had mentioned. Enough to erase the mountain of debt that had dictated every moment of her life. There was no note, no message, only the cold, hard finality of the numbers. It was his last move, a final, clean cut. He was not just giving her safety. He was giving her back the life he had interrupted, closing the account on the debt he had once claimed she owed. It was an act of profound care disguised as a sterile, impersonal transaction. She stood at her window for a long time, the check held loosely in her hand, watching the city wake up. The rain had stopped, and the morning sun cast long, lonely shadows between the buildings. The money in her hand was freedom, a future, a life for her sister. But it was also a wall, a final, insurmountable barrier between his world and hers. He had paid her off, not as a lover or a friend, but as a complication that needed to be resolved. The silence that stretched between them now was no longer temporary, it was permanent. It was the sound of a door closing, of a story ending, and the echo of everything that could never be resonated in the quiet, empty space he had left behind. If this story of sacrifice and silence has touched you, show your support by liking and sharing this video. Comment below with your thoughts on whether true redemption is possible, even for a man like Dante. 6 months passed, each one a lifetime removed from the night on the pier. The city's seasons turned, from the bleak chill of winter to the tentative warmth of a Chicago spring. Maya was getting stronger, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. A quiet miracle, funded by an anonymous ghost. Alara, too, had been reborn. Tonight, She stood in a ballroom, nearly identical to the one that had been the stage for her humiliation. But she was not a server. She was a guest, invited by the hospital's board of directors in recognition of her sister's remarkable progress. She wore a simple, elegant dress, the color of midnight, her posture straight, her gaze steady. The clinking glasses and low hum of power no longer felt oppressive. They were simply sounds in a world she now understood, a world she could navigate with a quiet, unshakable confidence he had unknowingly given her. He was there, of course. She felt his presence before she saw him, a subtle shift in the room's gravitational pull. Dante Moretti stood in a secluded alcove, a silhouette of power against the glittering skyline, observing the affair with the detached air of a king surveying his court. He had not changed. The dark suit, the silver at his temples, the aura of controlled danger, it was all the same. Yet, as his eyes swept the room, they were not searching for threats or opportunities. They were searching for her. He had been watching, she knew, not as a predator, but as a distant, solitary guardian. He had built a fortress of silence around her, and from its highest tower, he kept his lonely vigil, ensuring the peace he had bought for her remained undisturbed by the darkness of his world. Then, across the crowded expanse of marble and crystal, their eyes met. The noise of the gala faded into a distant murmur, the glittering crowd dissolving into a blur. For a long, breathless moment, they were the only two people in the room, connected by an invisible thread of memory and sacrifice. In his gaze, she saw no ownership, no lingering claim. She saw a flicker of profound, aching pride. He was looking at the woman she had become, strong and unbroken, and in his eyes, she saw the quiet absolution of his own violent soul. She, in turn, offered him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of gratitude, of understanding, of a forgiveness so complete it needed no words. It was a silent acknowledgement that his brutal act had not broken her. It had freed her. A man in an expensive but ill-fitting suit approached her, his smile slick with an easy confidence she now recognized as a cheap imitation of true power. He moved too close, his words of flattery a clumsy invasion of her space. The old Ilara would have frozen, her discomfort a silent plea for escape. The new Ilara simply met his gaze with a look of such cold, quiet dismissal that he faltered. But before he could recover, she saw a movement in her periphery. Across the room, Dante gave a single, subtle dip of his chin to a man standing near the exit. Within seconds, a waiter appeared at the intruder's elbow, murmuring something about an urgent message. The man was escorted away, smoothly and irrevocably, a minor inconvenience erased from her path. His protection was still there, a ghost's touch, as silent and absolute as ever. She knew then that it was time to leave. She had seen him, and he had seen her. The circle was complete. She turned from the grand spectacle, from the world of shimmering surfaces and shadowed depths, and walked toward the exit. She did not look back, but she could feel his eyes on her, a silent blessing following her out into the cool night air. She was not fleeing his world. She was choosing her own, a life of quiet peace that he had made possible. His redemption was not in finding love or escaping his throne, but in this single, selfless act. Seeing the light he had protected walk away from his darkness, whole and unafraid. He had saved a life, and in doing so, had found a sliver of the honor he thought he had lost forever. He remained in the shadows of his kingdom, a lonely king who had won his most important war. She stepped out into the city lights, no longer a ghost but a woman forged in fire, ready to live the life he had given back to her. They were two separate souls, moving in different orbits, forever bound by a debt that had been paid in blood and silence. He had given her back her life, and she, in turn, had given him a reason to remember his own. If you believe their silent sacrifice was the truest form of connection, share this story so others can feel its power. Like this video, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments what that final look between them truly meant to you.